So, this is the first podcast for 2022. Always amazes me that I'm still here for the last few years. And I think a lot of people think the same. So now it's a new year. Ironically, I'm doing something that a few years ago was a regular feature, which I used to call Today's Office, because I used to have to go walking to sort of recover from an illness. But I'm out walking again, and interestingly, it's this sort of idea of the peripatetic. The teacher who walks, basically. So this is all fairly relevant, but it does certainly give me a chance to think, which I think is quite. There's something in the sort of flow of just putting one foot in front of the other and swinging your arms. Seems to activate the brain somehow. So maybe people like Socrates had it right in that. So it's really made me reflect on the year before, of course. I've had some brilliant guests on the show, which I'm always grateful for, that people are willing to sort of give up their time to sort of chat. Certainly for me, talking to people is a way of actually learning. I learn so much from people's take on life, and to sort of put that into some sort of artistic context. So yeah, it's been very exciting, and one of the things that keeps sort of coming up for me is about asking questions. Obviously, because that's what I do when I interview people. I don't script anything, and that might be fairly obvious from the way the podcast interviews go. But obviously I have to listen very intently to what people say. And I am genuinely fascinated by people's lives. And hopefully that comes across in the interviews. And obviously I've interviewed people that are quite well known and others that are not so well known. But I don't think it actually matters to me how much sort of notoriety people have got, because everybody has got an interesting story and an interesting way that their lives have panned out because of that. And for some of those people, they've done this by actually asking very interesting questions of themselves and their situation and what they can do, particularly when life has taken a bit of a turn in a direction they didn't anticipate. And oh my God, isn't that not true for most people over the last couple of years? And then it seems that there is an opportunity for something really creative. Whereas, of course, when we get stuck in a rut of thinking, we end up doing the same things, don't we? So it sort of brought me around to thinking about the idea of this particular podcast, about asking the obvious questions. And that may not be so obvious as it seems, because sometimes the obvious question that you should be asking isn't the one you're asking. I've often found that when you're thinking creatively, the obvious question is the one that comes before the one that you are asking. So just take, for instance, you're asking something hypothetical here. Let's say you're asking yourself, what should I do next? That predisposes that what you're doing now is the right thing. But of course, if you ask yourself, why am I doing what I'm doing now? Or in the case of, certain creatives, I'm thinking of Brian Eno here, throwing in a wild card that makes you reassess where you could go by a chance turn of a card, like his oblique strategy cards, or you throw a dice or whatever, just to think, well, you've got other options. And what would happen if you were to take one of those things? See what ideas this sort of presents. So obviously, when we look at this time of the year and we've got things like New Year's resolutions, and I don't know how many people do that sort of thing anymore, but maybe they never did, I don't know. But it was always one of those things that was sort of touted that people did, and often they would only last for a few days. But the idea of starting something new, but if you started from the assumption that you're starting from a completely different place from where you assume you are, that can lead to some very, very interesting creative places. So during the podcasts, I've had some people that I'm thinking of people like Jonathan Howells, who was a friend of mine who's a drummer, who had I think it was 2008 when things went sort of tits up, he had a lot of work that was to do with functions and stuff like that, with bands, and that all just sort of fell apart. And he looked at that and thought, well, what can I do? Because the internet and social media was beginning to become the thing that it has become, he got onto LinkedIn and started contacting people about doing sessions online so that he could send them a file. Now, going back to that particular time, this was really early on, and of course he built a really successful session playing business off the back end of that. But he said he contacted a few hundred studios and producers personally. He didn't send out a generic email. He contacted each person individually. So a couple of questions there. Obviously he was forced into that. But a couple of questions that he could have arrived at, or we could all arrive at, instead of just doing the obvious, which is like sending out some sort of generic email, but actually taking the time to speak to people personally. That question might have been, why don't people talk to me anymore in the way that they used to? Which would then start to think, well, maybe I need to contact people and speak to them personally. And often with these type of questions, when you get to them, they seem like obvious. That's what I was saying. It's the case of like asking the obvious question. So that was an interesting point, I think, raised by him. There was also, coming from a sort of creative perspective, we often, a lot of our ideas are based on thinking that's not even ours, thinking that's been given to us by other people. We don't question, and of course in this particular period of time, we're made not to question things. Obviously, COVID's a good example of that, I think. Which is, why is it that consistently in this culture we do the proverbial kicking the can down the road? So we saw it again, coming back to the 2008 crash, we saw that, where somebody thought it was a great idea to bundle up securities and all the rest of it and flog them off to people, and then discovered, of course, that you can't just hide risky assets in a bundle of other things, because it brings the whole lot down, which of course anybody looking back on it would have gone, well, that's like bleeding obvious. But of course it wasn't, because somebody made it look as if that was plausible and got everybody else to think it was plausible. But of course, to get out of it, we did a number of things which effectively stopped the immediate collapse of the economy, but didn't actually eradicate the problem. Now, I don't have the figures in front of me, but going back in time to that scenario, it was said then that these things were basically being shoved around on balance sheets. Now, I'm not interested in that so much, but it's the idea which really sits underneath much of Western modernity, which is everything's fine, but there's a problem here, and if we just do that, it'll sort of fix it or make it go away, without looking at the situation about how did that arrive in the first place, which again is a situation staring us in the face that nobody wants to look at, because it's sort of upstream, and lots of things of course are predicated on the same thinking. So looking at the idea of capitalism and the way that works, and how it's still this idea that you've got some sort of wage slave, and on many different levels. Obviously the wage slave in the East, that's being sort of used for to line the pockets of people in the West, is on one level, and then people in the West that are being basically used with 0 hours contracts and all the rest of it to line the pockets of the people who effectively own them. Now, again, this isn't new. This is as old as empires. Empires had to have some sort of slavery, and we still see the same thing. But we just take that as being normal, which I suppose it is. And to some extent, by extension, we assume that it's actually right, which I'm not sure that it is. But it is what it is. So we've got this thing, with the economic system, but it's in everything. So you look at how modern medicine works, and obviously modern medicine is very clever and does some incredible things, and I might not be here if it wasn't for that, and take that as a point. But the point is that it's very good at looking at the thing and going, oh yes, like, I can see what your problem is, Governor. You just need to, we need just to do blah blah, and that's it. And interestingly, very interestingly, I've just come across a sheep skull, almost on a crossroads. So I won't touch that for the moment. I'll just leave that there. But yeah, here we go. We're in the wilds of Sussex here, so which is not as wild as I'll make it sound, but there we go. So modern medicine is built on that. Now, of course, the problem is that we have in the West, primarily in America and in the UK, a vast problem with chronic sickness, chronic illness, people that are on permanent medication. And of course, if you want to make money, you really want to make a tablet that people have to take for the rest of their life. You don't want something that fixes it, really. Now, I know that's, there is an element of that. I'm not saying that's the case in all cases, but there is an element of that in pharmaceuticals, obviously. Now, there is a history of that type of thinking, that you don't want just the simple thing that will fix something, because nobody's going to make any money, all right? And that does influence it. Now, it might not be the doctors who think this, but it's certainly the people that produce, they're selling shares, basically, in big pharma. And there is an element of that. I'm not saying it's pervasive, but there we go. So one of the big problems, obviously, that we are faced with is obesity. So the figures are just off the top of my head, I think it's the age range between 45 and 72. 3/4 of the people in that age bracket are definitely overweight, but potentially obese. Now that is frightening. Just think about that for a minute. 3/4 of the people are that far overweight. Now, it's not, we know that being overweight and being obese is a killer. But it's a killer on many levels. It's not just to do with diabetes and everything like that. It seems that the thing that actually drives this, of course, is the intake of sugar that we have in the West. If we went back a few generations to my grandparents, so that's going back a little bit, but a child now would consume more sugar in their first 5 years of life than my grandparents had in the entirety of their life. Now, just think about that. That is mind-boggling. Now, it is known that certain types of cancers thrive on sugar. So there we go. We've instantly got something that is a massive health issue. Now, I know of a GP in the UK who was cautioned because he told one of his patients that they shouldn't eat so much. Obviously, the person was chronically overweight, and the guy took him to the medical. It made a complaint to the medical tribunal, or whatever it was called. So it just goes to show that we've got this bizarre situation where, and that's, there's probably a link between COVID and all those sort of infectious diseases and things like people being overweight, but like a lot of the data, it's easy to collect but not easy to read. I'll just park that out there. Numbers that are bounded around in relation to nothing. So of course any number looks big when you start doing that, but it's not compared to anything. And then certain bits of data that sort of come before all of that seem to be ignored. Now, I'm just, putting that there as the questions that we're asking ourselves about how we're dealing with things. Obviously, it's been, all the vaccination stuff that's gone on, and then we get this deluge of a new viral strain, which was inevitable because that's what viruses do. They mutate, they often become weaker but more virulent from the point of view of contagion. That's not uncommon. I'm pretty sure. I'm not a virologist, so I'm just sort of, but I'm certainly interested in history. And obviously historically, these patterns happen in particular ways. We're very fortunate that we have much better housing than our ancestors did. We have access to clean water, and I was going to say, we don't obviously do enough exercise, and we're not out in the open as much as they were, and we're certainly not as fit and strong as they were. I mean, we always have this idea that people were sort of, infested with all sorts of stuff, but in actual fact, these people are amazingly strong and incredibly fit, which we are not. I mean, if you think about these stories of, I live quite near Lewes, and there's the old coach road, and the old fish women used to walk from Newhaven and Seaford all the way to Lewes down a coach road carrying loads of fish. I mean, it's miles, miles and miles, and then walk all the way back again. Just incredible, and that's not talking about ploughing a field or tending to sheep or the type of things that people used to walk absolutely miles and miles every day in all weathers. They were hard as nails. And we sort of forget that. We just think, that they were susceptible to all sorts of stuff, but they didn't have the just trying to avoid not being knocked over. They didn't have the sort of lifestyles that we had from the point of view of the fact that we have warm homes and all the rest of it. So, and the other thing is that one of the surprising results of the rationing in the Second World War was that the population was probably its fittest and healthiest, and many people lived incredibly long lives because of the reduction in food intake. Again, a lot of this stuff is sort of just doesn't go with the logical way of thinking, and we're doing absolutely the opposite at the moment. So let's look at what we can do then at the moment. Start questioning things about your own life. That's a sort of a couple of questions before the one that you would ask. So, for instance, should I move house? Here's a good one. We then start thinking, well, why should I move house? Why am I living here? Why do I want to move somewhere else? Do I need a house? Now, I'm not suggesting that you all go and live in some sort of caravan somewhere, but it's just really looking at the situation about what is that thing that we've got that's a house, instead of a home. And if you had a home, would you think about it so much as some sort of financial asset, which I'm not sure people in Europe tend to do, because there's so much more renting in Europe, and the legislation is such that it's tricky as a house owner, a landlord, to be able to sort of make that extraordinary amount of money that they do here. Well, somebody makes the money. It's probably the banks, actually, to be quite, to be fair. But and obviously the housing market is the thing that drives the economy here, and that's how, of course, we end up with such a lot of political manoeuvrings in order to keep the house market up at its, quite frankly, unrealistic levels, which of course didn't happen in Ireland when, again, the 2008 crash came in. So, maybe asking questions that are more probing about that leads us to much more creative decisions, and creative thoughts that could take you into another perspective of life, particularly as lots of people are not happy. Lots of people are very depressed, particularly young people, which is a very big concern for me, as I am involved teaching and have taught many young people, and I do see how sensitive the young are, and a lot of them are being fed stuff that, to be quite frank, is, I think we will look back and think, like all generations do when we look back, I think that was a load of old nonsense, really. Whether that's some sort of political belief, which again, if you look at a lot of the political beliefs that we've had over the years, we could sort of look back and think, well, that was all very suspect, and we can see that there's no shining beacon of light in any political form, actually. So that's a starter. Got some interesting guests lined up in the next month, but as we're in a season of people recovering from New Year and the old year, it might be a couple of weeks before I get some of those on board. I've got somebody lined up for this week, which will be very interesting. But yes, so it leaves me just to wish you a very happy and prosperous new year, and good health. And when I say prosperous, if we go back to the old Saxon idea of wealth, it was actually to do with being wholesome, being healthy. So I wish you that. So until then, all the best.